So welcome back to the second session. So at the end of the first session, some of the questions I had, and maybe it will be answered in the second, is there was a talk about individual responsibility and character and virtue, but we know that corporations are an entity, more than one person. How do we enforce these? The title of this panel is Human Rights Implementation and Compliance, and how people go beyond just mere compliance. We'll hear about some successes, challenges by different companies. We're represented by many different industries, people from many different industries. I'll introduce the moderator for this session, Kevin McGarry. Kevin is the Associate Director for the Elfenworks Center for Responsible Business. He's also an accounting professor here at St. Mary's. And he's a lawyer, so he can argue with all of these panelists. Many of them have a law background. He's also a member of UNCTAD, and if you don't know the full form, it's the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And they have a business impact initiative, so he's a member of that. And we are planning maybe to become a member of that at some point as well. So he has an LLM degree, as I mentioned, in international taxation. And so I'll let Kevin take over from here. And thank you all for being here for the second panel. And I'll put this here.
All right, thank you very much, Saroja. So, and also thank you, all of you, for attending, and for our first group of panelists that gave us an interesting, slightly different perspective, but related to what we're going to have in the second panel associated with business and industry compliance. And as was mentioned at the very beginning of this conference, the general idea behind this was to essentially think about what has happened in essentially the 10 years since the initial development of the United Nations Guiding Principles. And essentially those guiding principles are based on, it's called the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. And what that relates to are these three core pillars of basically a state duty to protect with regard to human rights, a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and then an access by victims of human rights violations to an effective remedy, whether it be through judicial means or non-judicial means. And so those three pillars form the foundation of essentially the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework, which underscores the United Nations Guiding Principles. Now, as was also mentioned earlier in our first panel, we had the kind of North Star, as Lauren mentioned, about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And then we had kind of an evolution later on into other forms, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And all these things coming together with now we're in a time period where we have a development in additional legal frameworks and then also voluntary frameworks. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about on this panel, is seeing, well, what exactly have various cross-sections in business and industry been doing in relation to human rights? And then talking about some of these aspects of some of these participatory and voluntary frameworks to respect human rights, engage in human rights from a for-profit business perspective. And so I have quite a few different panelists with several diverse backgrounds that are going to talk to you about what they do in their industry, in their business. And so our very first panelist is actually going to be Desta Rains. And Desta Rains, just to tell you a little bit about her background, so her most recent role, she's done a lot of work in corporate social responsibility, and her most recent role, she served as Apple's labor and human rights manager. And so now she has recently joined Fairtrade USA, where she's the director for apparel and home goods. And so she's going to be our first panelist. And so some of our panelists, they all have presentations, and they're going to talk in conjunction with their presentation. So I'm going to load up Desta's presentation now.
I think because I'm short, I'm going to stand over here and click and talk at the same time. Today, I'm going to hopefully set the stage for our panel, and I'm going to give you a general and broad overview over the notion of business and human rights. And I want to get this started by putting a question out there, which was an interesting question for me to think about when I first entered the field of corporate social responsibility, which is, what do big consumer goods companies do? Companies like Apple, companies like Nike, et cetera. And if anybody in the audience wants to put out there what do these companies do? All right. Okay. That's the answer. What he said is that they make products and they make goods, and that's what I always said and always thought as well, but actually what they do is design and market goods. If you think about it, they actually are not manufacturing anything. They are outsourcing their manufacturing, which is where this whole field of corporate social responsibility was born. The notion that companies have a responsibility to look into their supply chains and understand what the social and environmental conditions are of those supply chains. Thank you for your answer, because that is not an incorrect answer, but it's also, there's a fine line and sort of a subtle difference in that. So I'm going to go back and take you through kind of my evolution into the field of corporate social responsibility, which started back in 1998 in Vietnam. I was the executive director of the American Chamber of Commerce, and I sat in my office one day, and two people came into my office from an organization that's San Francisco-based called Business for Social Responsibility, and they were there to talk to me about what had just happened at the Nike factory in Vietnam. So what had happened is that PricewaterhouseCoopers had gone in and done a social audit and found a lot of issues, and somebody somehow had leaked that information out to the press, and Nike stock took a big nosedive, and everybody was jumping up and down. So this is some of the stuff that came back out at that time. Bad conditions, what's going on, this girl's getting paid $1.60 to make the shoes, Michael Jordan, this was like all over the place. But sitting there at the time in Vietnam, I was really intellectually curious. It didn't really make sense to me that, first of all, the government wasn't looking at the conditions there, right? The labor law, the environmental law, what was happening there. And secondly, why was Nike, or to what degree was Nike responsible for what was happening in that facility? So with that in mind, I put it in the back of my head, and when I decided to come back to the United States, I thought about working in the field of corporate social responsibility, but I really wanted to understand what is corporate social responsibility, and whose responsibility is corporate responsibility? Does it rest with the government? Does it rest with the companies? Is it a joint responsibility? And who actually does what in this space? And I also thought about who really cares about this? So part of it is brand recognition, and I think there's companies here today, like Numi is here, that it's part of their ethos. Patagonia is another company where from the leadership of the company all the way through, this is not just, I think for certain companies, a brand marketing scheme, it's also how they are. It's part of the culture of the company. And as I think you're also starting to see some consumer demand that's driving an interest in this space. And so more and more brands are coming to the table that want to make products. So I've recently joined Fairtrade USA, and in this role, I'm Senior Director of Apparel and Home Goods. We work with companies like West Elm, we work with Patagonia, we work with Athleta, which is a Gap brand, and more and more companies are coming to us. They like the idea of fair trade and what that means. And just on the sidelines, what fair trade is that the companies are paying, you as a consumer are paying a little bit more for these fair trade goods, and then the companies are also paying money that goes directly into a bank account that's controlled by a group of workers who's democratically elected. And those workers get to decide how they want to spend those premium payments. Some workers are using it for setting up healthcare or daycare centers. Others are using it to take-home pay. Some are getting consumer goods that they may not have had access to. So the notion about what that looks like and empowering workers is also something I'll be getting to in this presentation today as well. But who is involved in this? Obviously, companies are involved in corporate social responsibility. We also have auditing firms. There's a huge industry out there of companies that provide social auditing and environmental auditing to go look in the field at supply chain, labor, and environmental conditions. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, it's global, and its companies have taken on more and more responsibility of looking at that. They've, in some cases, almost taken over the role of a labor or an environmental inspector in the country, which gets me to the second part, which is governments. Right? In essence, the governments are responsible for looking at the labor and environmental conditions in their supply chains, but in countries that have less governance, not the ability or the desire to actually follow through on the laws, which are generally well written, the corporate and the private sector are taking on a bigger and bigger role in looking at enforcement. Same thing with trade unions. In an ideal situation, you have unions that are elected and able to represent the interests of the workers, but you have a lot of situations in countries where these trade unions are tied to political parties, they're not independent, or they're not freely elected. In certain countries like China and Vietnam, communist countries would be good examples of that, where the government itself controls the union. Then we also have non-governmental organizations. There's campaigning organizations, there's just organizations that want to do good for the world, and they all fall into the space of who's looking at what's happening in the greater world. And we have multilateral organizations, which we're here to talk about in part today, the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, the International Organization of Migration, which looks at the refugee crisis and helps to mitigate that and funnel people to the right places. And we also have socially responsible investors, SRIs, which can be the banks. There's also funds that specifically invest in companies that they feel do a good job when it comes to corporate social responsibility and triple bottom line investing. So what is happening today? And this is my opinion, what I see happening in the world. Right now, there's a push out there to go further and go deeper. And we see some of this being legislated, conflict minerals legislation, or more transparency. Let's go see what's happening with the seafood industry, what those people who are slaves, who are going out there and fishing and getting seafood for us. Let's go see who's picking the cotton, who's spinning the cotton, and let's go see who's mining the materials in our cell phone for our batteries. And I think that's okay. It's a nice notion, but we still have a lot of issues at Tier 1. So I just want to flash up here a couple of headlines that I pulled out. The child labor car batteries with cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A girl just 2 weeks ago who committed suicide at a spinning mill in India. She found out she was 14 years old. So we're going deeper then. She's at a spinning mill. This is not at the final assembly plant. So when I talk about Tier 1, I'm talking about who's actually putting the products together. But we see there's a lot of things happening down below, but we also have a lot of issues happening above, so to speak, higher in the supply chain. So how to tie this all together, I think, is an important thing for us to think about. So I see legislation as a lever. Right? Legislation helps to set expectations for companies and how multinational companies should operate. So we start here in California with the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act that came to California in 2010. This was Kamala Harris as the Attorney General. This was a big win for her in getting this passed here in California. It was kind of a one of its kind and really set the trend for later legislation. But in essence, what this act is requiring is that companies not only train their employees on how to mitigate risks of trafficking in their supply chains, but also report publicly. So it has a certain financial threshold, and if you look at most companies' websites now, you can click through and see their disclosure based on this act. And from this act, we then went to the UK. The UK developed a similar law, and now Australia is working on a similar law, and this is specific to trafficking and specific to supply chains. Then we also had the Dodd-Frank Act, which had this conflict minerals provision, which required companies to report if they were sourcing materials from the Democratic Republic of the Congo or joining countries that were helping to support the war or the warlords in those countries. There's been civil war there for many, many, many years due to the riches of the country. This is a very expensive law to implement. It's been a big, I'd say most companies would say it's been a big burden for them. They've put a lot of resources into it, into filing these disclosures and to do the due diligence that's necessary to know where your materials are coming from. I think it's a good thing that people are able to now do it, but that birthed legislation in the European Union. So recently here in the United States, the SEC, who was the enforcement arm in order to read this, has rolled this back. In the United States, you don't have to disclose anymore, technically, but now you do for Europe. So it's out there in the world as well. But with legislation, sometimes it has unintended consequences. You might find that companies withhold information because they want to show that they're showing progress year over year, so they might be doing 12 things, but they know they have to report out every year, so why are they going to dump out the 12 things in year one reporting? They give you 5 things, 2 things, 4 more things over time. So that can be an unintended consequence, which maybe isn't as positive as we'd want it to be. And there's also a fear of lawsuits. So here in California in the past couple of years, both Nestle and Costco were sued because they had seafood that they were carrying in their supply chain, they were selling in their stores that was supposedly made with slave labor. So both of these lawsuits were dismissed, but there's a fear of litigation, I think, that multinational companies have, especially knowing that, even if the lawsuit is dismissed or isn't dismissed, their name is out in the newspapers as a company that has bad business practices. So here we also are talking today about voluntary principles. And it started off with the UN Global Compact, which was years ago, and it was a really nice, have your CEO sign this letter and say you subscribe to this. It was nice, but it had no teeth. So I think, the United Nations realized that they weren't getting a lot of traction with that, and they wanted to take it a step further, which is where we ended up with the guiding principles. And I think the guiding principles has been a really good thing to have out there in the world. It's given common language and common expectations around what multinational companies are expected to do, which is to talk about their human rights risks, talk about how they mitigate the risks of those human rights risks in their supply chains, and the actions that they're taking. It's encouraging companies to look more deeply and have a better understanding of what that looks like for them, and then also disclose that publicly. So companies that aren't disclosing, institutional investors, consumers, other interested people, they don't really know how to read companies like that right now. If you don't have a human rights disclosure and you don't define what human rights means for you, it's a little hard for people to know what's going on. So I think this has been a really good thing in kind of setting up a framework for something for people to look at. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, I have that here, these 17 goals. I think these are great in sort of going out there in the world and setting up big ideas. But in terms of implementation, it's a little bit all over the map. Some companies we're doing some of these SDGs, we're doing 1 or 2 of these, we're doing none of these. It's a little muddied right now, but again, they're all very nice, very big, huge goals and something to strive for, but it's not organized in any fashion. And I think, the point I want to make here is that voluntary compliance, it spurs attention, but it doesn't really go deep enough or far enough for lasting and sustainable change. Back in 1991, Levi Strauss was the first corporation to set out a multinational code of conduct around expectations of its business partners. And that's so many years ago. And as you've seen from some of the examples I've given in the presentation today, how much has really changed, right? In terms of just making that voluntary, that expectation set out. So what do I see happening in the future? I'm not a pessimist here. I think there's some good things happening. I think, one thing that we are seeing is industry collaboration. And industry collaboration is really good because it helps to bring people of this like mind together. And while it doesn't always lead to fast change, it leads to slow, steady change moving forward. And like my recent experience at Apple, we were members of an industry association, and while we were taking a leadership role, and we were giving a lot of sort of intellectual property and leadership into the organization, we were also at the same time trying to pull people along, prod and push along. And I think we started to see some of that happening by taking active roles in different work groups and sort of bringing up different issues that were important to us. So I think things can move through industry collaboration and cross-industry collaboration as well. There's also this notion of worker empowerment, right? As workers are going out, social auditors are going out and talking to workers, if people ask you enough times, how are you working 60 hours a week? Are you working 7 days a week? And you realize you're not supposed to be doing more than 60 hours, or you're not supposed to be working 7 days a week, workers are starting to think about it a little bit more. And I think there's also this notion of giving workers a little bit more ownership. Like they're not just receptive or just sitting back at the other side of it. They actually, if they're educated and understand something about their rights, maybe there's a chance for them to step up and have a better and more equal conversation around what that should look like. We're also seeing a big interest in conscious consumerism. There's a lot of brands, like, especially, next generation and so forth. They're looking at brands and looking at, where they buy and thinking a little bit more deeply about what that looks like. Target's just launched a brand recently on the Unconscious Threads, and that's really about, and they've actually just signed on with Fairtrade USA, which is interesting, bringing fair trade goods to the mass market. And what does that look like? The whole notion around this brand is, it's not just, it's kind of a brand for everyone. It's an inclusive brand, the way they're thinking about it, the way they want to market it. So you'll start to see that in the next year or so, Target having some fair trade goods in the apparel space and home goods space. There's also the circular economy, which is the notion of recyclability, making products through. And there's also this very slow but steady movement trying to address issues, like using the UN guiding principles as a framework. So as more companies start to look at it and think about it and address it, I think we'll see more movement there. I would just ask you today, please be patient and thoughtful. And I'm going to finish with these pictures and just think, like, everything that you're wearing today, the battery in your cell phone, there was a human set of hands that touched that product and helped to make it and to bring it to you today. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Desta. So building upon what Desta set up here, actually, specifically in relation to supply chains and human rights, our next speaker is actually also a St. Mary's alum, Brian Derke, who Brian's the Chief Operating Officer for Numi Organic Tea. And he's as a result, very heavily involved in a lot of their supply chain operations and the issues with that. He received his MBA from St. Mary's College. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. I'm actually going to take this off too. Well, thank you, everyone, and it's a pleasure following you, Desta, because there's a lot of touch points there. Yes, I am a St. Mary's grad, and it's really special for me to be back here today. I haven't been here for several years. I actually live pretty nearby, so I probably shouldn't be such a stranger, but St. Mary's was the place where I fell in love with economics, and it's the place where I learned how to take managing business in about 25 different countries and turn it into a coherent international strategy. And it's probably most importantly the place where I learned that empathy and collaboration can really be the best instruments to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. And fortunately for me, after I left St. Mary's, even prior to me being at St. Mary's, I've been working for Numi Organic Tea, and that's really been the vehicle for me to do those things. So as COO, I manage the overall business and do a lot of general management type of role, but a big passion of mine and a big integral part of our business, and it's really baked in the DNA in our business model, is sustainable sourcing and values-led supply chain management. So how many people here have heard of Numi Tea? A few, great. Well, something we're trying to focus on is really driving change in the tea industry in general. We've seen a lot of change in the last decade. If you go back to the late 90s, people didn't even know what a tea plant looked like. If you talked about tea, you'd envision a tea bag. Similar to coffee in the 80s, you'd envision a can of coffee. And did I touch something? Thank you very much. And what we try to do is really change that paradigm and really connect the farmers with the consumers and do that through and throughout our entire business model. So our core values are really 4 pillars, 3 that I'm talking about here, and the 4th, which you might imagine would be profits. But we focus on celebrating people, celebrating planet, and celebrating pure tea. And from a people perspective, which we're going to focus on more so today, we're the leading importer of fair trade tea in the North American market. We got to that level in about 2010. It was a goal we set in 2003 to get to. So we've been, for about 8 years straight now, the leading importer of fair trade tea. I think more importantly is that we hold direct relationships with all of our farming communities. We have a tremendous level of traceability back to each of the individual farming communities. So although we're incredibly excited about being a leader of fair trade, we also look at that as kind of a baseline, and it allows us to do more things with our farming communities. So we focus on that tremendously. We also have our own standard that we created called Fair Labor Practices. We did that in conjunction with SCS, who's an auditor for fair trade, and a number of other different programs. And that's helped fill in the gaps in a lot of places where fair trade wasn't the best fit. From a Celebrating Planet perspective, obviously organics, we look at that as the highest level of the umbrella for us. It deals with worker health safety, and it deals with ecological and environmental safety as well, and just developing sustainable agriculture. One of the things we're really focused on now is, I heard about a little bit earlier, was carbon sequestration in our supply chain. Really focusing on that. Agriculture, most people don't know, is perhaps behind energy one of the second largest contributors to global warming, but it's also potentially one of the biggest solutions. So we've actually just did a GHG, greenhouse gas inventory of our entire supply chain last year, over 34 countries and about 120 different farms, and we've learned that our business at this point is actually carbon net positive because of the organic sequestration that we're seeing in the farm level. So we're really excited about that. It's funny, people attack transportation, people attack a lot of things. If you look at a cup of tea that you consume in the United States, 12% of the carbon emissions is transportation. 68% of those emissions is actually at the farm level and the production level. So we've actually learned to reprioritize things when we look at the planet. And then when we look at pure tea, we focus on only organic products. We don't use any oils or flavorings. And I think one of the most important things that we do is we try to connect, again, the consumer with the authenticity of where the products come from. And this is part of our whole model of trying to make sure that we're having an end-to-end sustainable business, both from a social and environmental standpoint. And of course, there's profits. And profits, all of these things in our business model drive profits. But then profits in turn drive all of these things. So it's kind of the quadruple bottom line that our founders baked in 18 years ago when we founded the business. But it was before quadruple bottom lines or triple bottom lines were in vogue at that point. It was just what they wanted to do. And so it's been really fun for me to kind of inherit leadership in this business to be able to take that on. So it's also kind of our own version of a flywheel, like Amazon's flywheel. You hear a lot about that and from a business perspective. But any one of these things that you feed accelerates the others. So the more good we do for people, the more profits we're driving. The more good we do for the planet, the more profits we're driving. The more profits we're driving, the more we can do these things. So it kind of becomes a self-fulfilled prophecy that we try to keep that momentum going. I think what's most important about our business, and that's why I wanted to touch on collaboration and things that I've learned here at St. Mary's, as well as in my professional experience, is that our core belief from a human rights standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint in general is that collaboration and intimacy at the farm level and throughout our entire supply chain is the key to our success. And that is what's helped separate us from what other companies are doing, and it's what has helped us achieve a lot of our sustainable goals. Well, let's talk about tea, and it's a little bit similar to yours, Desta. Some headlines, but tea is historically a big culprit of human rights abuses. It's really bad, and you can look up tea online, and you can find dozens and dozens of headlines about how bad the tea industry is, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I could spend the entire afternoon talking about that, but I'll bring up a couple of different key points. One is that tea is kind of a colonial production process that marginalizes labor. And that's a big deal. A lot of the labor, I think India is one of the most egregious areas, although we do a lot of work in India. I believe we do good work there. But you're dealing with laborers, more than 3 million laborers in India. And a lot of these people are from minority groups. A lot of them are still to this day living in kind of colonial environments. And you're seeing a lot of them being relocated throughout the country only to be working in tea. And there's huge abuses for these people, terrible living conditions, absolutely abysmal living conditions, really poor access to sanitation, to health benefits, to health services whatsoever. You're seeing major wage abuses, you're seeing child labor, you're seeing all these different things, and this manifests into a whole society of people that ends up being illiterate, ends up being malnourished, ends up shortening their life expectancies. It's really tough. So the whole colonial aspect of tea, and this occurs not only in India, but in Malawi and Kenya and Sri Lanka, it's a very big issue with tea. And it was one of the reasons why our founders got involved with tea, because we thought we could help drive a change. A second piece of what drives the human rights issues in tea is the fact that it's more of an economics point, but it's domestic consumption. Now, in 2015, 5.3 million tons of tea were produced globally. Only 1 million tons was actually exported. So the majority of tea is actually drunk in home countries. And when you look at that, you look at Turkey, India, and China consume more tea than all other countries combined. And they're not necessarily the flagship for the best human rights track records. So what you have here is these people who are consuming tea who don't have a lot of money, and it's the second most drunk beverage after water and throughout the world, and so they're paying almost nothing for their tea. So it creates and it facilitates an environment that just doesn't make any sense, where the cost of tea, or more importantly, the willingness for people to pay for the tea, is actually less than the cost of production, which then kind of goes back to driving the tea worker down. I think a third thing, when you look at the export side of it, which obviously we're involved with, the export side was really designed 150 years ago to hold down the tea worker, and it was really designed to create almost an abusive situation. The industry is dominated by a small handful of traders who buy tea from the different growing countries, and then those traders sell to the brands. So in most cases, when you buy a box of tea from a grocery store shelf, that brand you're buying has never met their farmer, they've met their trader. And the trader's job is to drive costs down as much as possible to maximize profits for the brand holder. So you have this terrible distribution of wealth. And that's one of the things we always talk about internally at NUMMI is how do we focus on the redistribution of wealth, and how do we move that wealth upstream as opposed to having it all be at the brand holders or these traders who are creating this environment. So there's a lot of big issues about tea. Now for us, we've really combated that with the fact that we focus on, again, these direct relationships. We're well aware of the guiding principles. We're well aware of the UN Global Compact and the sustainable goals, but we don't measure ourselves necessarily against those. We're kind of in a different playing field. So what we do is we do align our objectives to those, but instead we try to do what we do best. And that is partner with people directly at the farm level and to find out what their specific needs are and then work hard to meet their needs. And that's something we've been focusing on since day one, and we continue to do so today. And a lot of that's done through, as we heard earlier, voluntary certification schemes. We're big proponents of fair trade, and we have our own fair labor standard that we work with. Now, from a fair trade perspective, we do look at all of this as kind of a baseline. It does make sure that the minimum requirements are made, and in a lot of cases, above and beyond is met. But it allows us to focus on deeper projects with our farmers. It allows us to focus on how we can actually help their communities specifically instead of having just a blanket situation. And another aspect of this is that we focus on growing the base of people who are certified to these standards. So we don't just buy from a list of people who are fair trade certified. We actually help new farmers become fair trade certified. We bring more people into the fold. We try to expand that supply base. And if you take a look here, you can see our global supply chain. And what I'm really proud of is that 89% of our ingredients are traced directly back to the farm level, the specific farm that we buy from. I think the industry norm is probably about 20% because most brands will know a couple different farms they work with, but they're working through traders. But you can see the different projects we have going on throughout the world. This year, in 2017, forgive me, alone, we had 5 different projects in China. We got 2 people verified, 2 different organizations and farming groups verified fair labor. We had 1 verified certified fair trade. We financed all of this, and we bake all of that into our cost of goods. It's part of our cost of doing business. All the dark blue countries, or the countries that are a little more illuminated, those are countries that we frequent the most. And we've been to every single one of those countries in the last 18 months. Now, we're a company that has 50 people, but I look at our business as having probably 20,000, because we include these farmers in the way we look at the business. So I myself actually just got back yesterday from Egypt, working on a couple different projects there, so I'm a little bit off today, so forgive me. It's past my bedtime, Cairo time, but we were working on bringing clean, safe drinking water access to the farmers in Egypt. And we're also working on helping them maximize their fair trade certification, which they already earned a couple of years ago. So I traveled there with a water engineer and a fair trade expert from Europe that I hired to go along with me, because I'm not an expert at this. What I like to think I'm an expert in is building relationships. But we bring in experts and we hire these experts to address these things to really strengthen the business. But this also makes very good business sense for us, because again, it's our value proposition. It's why we believe people buy our product, but it's also, it endears you very much so, and it provides a lot of security to your with your suppliers. I joke around that my job description has two objectives. One is to add value to the business, and the second is to make sure if the farmer had 1 pound of tea left that he would sell it to us. So that's kind of how we try to move forward with this. We also have our code of conduct, and this is just a snapshot of part of the table of contents of the code of conduct. This is aligned with ILO conventions, and we also have looked at dozens and dozens of other companies' codes of conduct. Ours is a lot different because ours is very aspirational. It's not so much a legal compliance. We want someone to sign to pass on the responsibility if there's any non-compliances. We seldom have non-compliances. We're trying to push people to take it to another level. So with this, we socialize this with our suppliers on annual visits throughout the world. We sit down. We've spent a whole day with a Chinese village walking through this document. We spent a whole day in Madagascar walking through this document. So we really look at it as kind of an aspirational piece. So we think between the voluntary certifications and what we look at from our code of conduct that we're fairly well covered. And what's more important to us is how do we go above and beyond, and how do we take it to the next level? These are some stats from 2016. And all of this, again, we bake into our cost of goods. What this doesn't show is the NUMMI Foundation. And the NUMMI Foundation is kind of bolted onto our commercial business. And we do projects in the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year back to our farms, whether it be environmental projects or clean water projects or other schemes that really help the communities there. And that's not included in this. But the NUMMI Foundation is something I sit on the board for, and we have to always walk a fine line with our board and with our lawyers on how we don't get them too intermingled, but they do intermingle to a certain extent. Maybe I shouldn't say that. And the fact that we believe in insetting as opposed to offsetting. So we wanted to start a water campaign. We were going to work with water.org on that. And we said, wait a minute, let's not do that. Let's give our farmers water. So let's use the projects, and instead of donating to an outsource, let's inset this project. We do the same thing with carbon sequestration. We no longer do carbon offsets. We now find ways to inset this into the supply chain. So I'm going to end by just telling you kind of a more specific example of how we approach the business. This right here is Tumeric Tea. We launched Tumeric Tea in 2014. It's been by far the most successful innovation we've had in the last 5 or 6 years. We launch new products every year. This has really taken off, the Tumeric Tea. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we approach it from start to finish. By the way, this was the top selling tea in Whole Foods in 2017. We got it into all of the Targets in September. And in April, we're rolling out into 4,200 Walmarts. So it's really taking off. And again, it's that whole profit thing that'll go back and feed the celebrating people, celebrating planet, and celebrating the pure tea. So we wanted to launch turmeric. And what we did was, I could have easily contacted a number of suppliers and found different turmeric, and you buy turmeric at the best price. Oh, we want it certified. Okay, we'll get it certified. We want it organic. Okay, we'll get it organic. That's not how we approach these projects. Instead, we searched around and talked to a lot of people and tried to find out where is there an opportunity to actually grow a community? Where is there an opportunity to actually help the farmers in a certain region? And I found out through a vanilla dealer that he had just come back from Madagascar. And in Madagascar, he said these farmers were there, and they were making this amazing turmeric, and they had tested it and had these health benefits that were through the roof. And I can't speak to that specifically, but we were really impressed. And he said, it's something you need to check out. So the owner of the company and I flew down there a month later, and we met with these farmers. And they live along this river in a very remote area of Madagascar, which is already remote in the first place. It's 13 different villages along the river. At that point, they were just starting to make turmeric tea, starting to grow turmeric. So we work with them, and in 2013, we helped them become organic certified, and we financed all of that, and we provided consultants to do the training. We got some NGOs in there and really worked on it. In 2014, we financed their fair trade certification. They formed a farmer cooperative. They brought all the different farmers together. So in 2014, we bought 6 tons of turmeric from them. It was all they were able to produce. It's fair trade certified. It was the first fair trade certified turmeric available on the market, the first export out of Madagascar. And then from there, we started buying more and more. This year, we bought 150 tons from them. So we've gone, in a matter of 3 years, from 6 tons to 150 tons. It's completely transformed this community. On this particular shot, this is right after they earned their fair trade certification. We were down showing them what the products look like and that type of thing. And we talked to them. We said, okay, we've figured out a way to give you access to market. We've figured out a way to get you organic certified to increase the value of your crops. We've figured out a way to get you fair trade certified. Now you're going to have more income coming in. We're going to promise you 3-year forecasts so you know how to plant, how to harvest, which is one of the biggest issues in agricultural production. What else do you need? What else can we do? What's the next step we can take? And it turns out all of these people had been drinking from the river for generations. It's the same river where they defecate. It's the same river where they wash their clothes, where their animals defecate, you name it. And they all had waterborne illnesses at one time or another during the year. There had even been some deaths on waterborne illnesses. So that's what gave us the idea when we were looking at the NUMMI Foundation of working with water.org. And we said, you know what? Forget water.org. Let's create our own program. And we created the program called Together for Hope, H2OP. And with that program, we were able to raise about $100,000 between our customers, between individual donors, and between the foundation itself. And we built 22 water wells in this community in a matter of 6 months. And now the entire community of about 4,000 people all have access to clean water. We've also put in precautions to make sure that these wells are maintained over time. So what we're guaranteeing to this community is that they'll have water for life. It's the first time they had ever seen running water. So it's pretty impressive what we were able to do in a very short period of time. That story was so successful for us that we're now modeling that in many places. And we've started a project in Assam, India. We started a project in South Africa, which desperately needs water. And that's what I was doing in Egypt over the last couple of weeks, is really focusing on the water campaign there. So my point of telling you the story is, one, to kind of share some of the things we're doing, but two, is that we look at these certifications on human rights as a baseline, and we look at what we can do above and beyond, and that becomes our value proposition. And it's worth the investment back in because it pays for itself tenfold from a commercial standpoint, and we're able to bring more good to the world by selling more, and that's what our whole business model is trying to do. So I leave you kind of with a call to action, and that is just, you know, this is kind of a good fair trade call to action, but when you go into a store and you're looking at different products, you know, you have an opportunity to vote with your dollar on what types of brands you want to support, what types of products you want to support. And I encourage you to really scrutinize that, because there's a lot of brands doing a lot of good things and there's a lot of brands that aren't. I think equally as business leaders, you devote your career to something where you can really make an impact. That's what I'm trying to do, and it's been the best decision of my life. So thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. So our next panelist is Victoria Mesa Estrada, and she unfortunately recently injured her leg, so out of empathy with her, I decided not to go up because she's going to be talking to you from her seat here. So thank you very much, Victoria, for soldiering on and coming out here, because I know this topic is, you're very passionate about it. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background about Victoria. I've known Victoria actually for over a decade now, which is kind of crazy. And so Victoria, she's done some work. She's an attorney, so she'll give you a little bit of a legal perspective on some of this. And she's done some work with the Migrant Rights Project for Florida Legal Services, handling class action lawsuits, covering over 1,000 migrant and domestic workers for violations of state and federal employment law, and might I say successfully handled class actions. And so she's also done some other things with various international organizations. She spent over 10 years in the nonprofit sector working with human rights, international development. and civil rights organizations such as the Colombian American Service Association, People for the American Way Foundation, and Oxfam America. So I'm going to hand it over to Victoria so she can tell you a little bit about her experience, some legal background, and then it's a good tie-in to follow up to the agricultural discussion that we just had in relation to tea.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'm sorry, I hope you guys can see me. I mean, I'm small, and being in this seat makes it really hard to, portray myself as a serious speaker. But I'm delighted to be here. I mean, this is certainly a subject that I'm extremely passionate about, just because I've been in both sides of the discussion, you could say. So, obviously, from my bio, you guys can see, I've been representing workers in the United States, mostly migrant and guest workers, and then domestic workers. So most of the remarks that I'm actually gonna do today are really about US issues. So when you talk about human rights, we're always talking about the third world and developing nations, et cetera. But the reality is that in the United States, we are still, you could say, behind. There's still a lot of human rights violations that we really do not recognize because we do not believe these things happen in the US. But when you go to these communities and you start seeing what's happening, obviously, it questions our principles, it questions our goals as human beings, as successful businesses, and many of my remarks will exactly go about that. So, I have a control, right? Oh, thank you. So, I always think about planting the seed and moving away from litigation into more of an advisor role for businesses. I guess this is the one thing that I always talk to businesses about. It's creating the footprint, it's planting the seed. And what are the things that should, empower your business, not only to, make profits, make money, but really to create that footprint that when people associate you with a brand, the remarks that we were listening before is when you go to Whole Foods, you're happy to buy that tea, that brand, because that's the footprint. Not only it's a great product, but they're an amazing company. And we always, we hear all these labels for trade, for labor, but how do we really get to the start of it, the supply chain? So I always tell businesses this. I think I live by this rule, is the respect of human dignity, is that no one should be invisible. And right now, for example, in this role where I'm disabled, temporarily disabled, the last few days for me, that has been crazy to see that I'm a ghost for many people, that I'm coming across in a rolling car and people don't even open the door. So that's when you think about the employees. Imagine being that, blue-collar worker with no education who doesn't understand what his rights are, and his bosses are pretty much not considering those factors when the worker, should be earning more money, but he's unable to complain about the conditions because he needs the job regardless, right? So, I think that's the main thing that I always tell businesses as they go along, as they want to create that footprint, is what are our principles? Do you know your workforce? And you'll be surprised to see that most people don't. Especially when you're sitting in the nice, comfortable office in the 20th floor of a nice building in San Francisco. You have no idea who your workforce is. And I always encourage employers to do that. Go back to the supply chain. If your business depends on the labor of Mexican guest workers, go back to Mexico and please take the time to see where these people come from. And in the US, this is a very important discussion right now nationally, where we hear, for example, in the agricultural industry, we are depending more and more on the guest workers to come and do the labor, because many employers, what they're finding is that they don't have a reliable workforce. So with farm workers and obviously immigration issues on the table, that's the perfect example. We all know that US agriculture depends on the hands of undocumented workers, a lot of them. But because there's been a crackdown on immigration, many farmers have found themselves in positions where they just don't have the labor anymore. So we are more dependent on exporting our workforce. And what are we doing to make sure that the people that we bring from another nation are really, having the rights, are understanding what they're entitled to. So, so I really think that's a really important thing, especially for U.S. businesses who conduct business here in the United States and who depend on that guest workforce, that they really need to get to know their workforce. Go to those countries. What are the community needs? I mean, if we are exporting people all the way from South Africa, let's think about that. Why do we need workers who have to come from so far? Maybe that's the discussion where you need to think locally. Okay, what are we doing wrong that we cannot find workers around here? And it's a discussion that I always encourage businesses to have. And then, I think taking a stand on social justice. As we move along as successful businesses, I think businesses play an important role to make governments accountable. And when you take that stand as a social justice, when you tell the government, we are not going to implement these crazy policies where you're asking us to discriminate against our employees, I think that's a really huge statement. When you hear, of policies where people are being segregated, isolated because of their LGBT status, because they're disabled, because of their age, when a business takes a stand against the government, you could say, when they say we're not going to play by these rules because they're wrong, that moral part of it, of the business, the power of a business to tell a government, you're doing this wrong, and this is why, I think that's the best footprint that a business can create in favor of human rights. This is not changing. There. Okay, so it just goes back to my following thing. It's action. Walk the talk. And again, as businesses, respect for human dignity should be the center of everything that you do for. We talk about sustainability. Again, we are saying we're paying good wages, workers are getting everything, but are we really making sure that they have, for example, the best housing? Are we making sure that their children can actually have access to education? Think about these businesses that require workers to spend 16-hour days there, like a packing house. A packing house in agriculture might have to run the entire day. What are you doing as an employer to make sure that your employee, it's getting all of the tools that they need to spend time with their family? Are you providing free daycare so they have the ability to, continue to work for you as you need them? Those kind of things, I always encourage that. And then it goes back to, the inclusion and diversity. Walk the talk. If we are all in favor of women's rights, okay, let's look at your leadership. How many women are empowered in your business? If you're talking about veterans, okay, in your leadership, who is the veteran? Are you really promoting and implementing those things that you preach for? Are you really doing it within your own business? I think you gotta have that self-criticism. And it's really empowering, for example, when you see those companies, when I come to a business that has created their own code of conduct, I think that's amazing. Because it really shows you that they're really creating that self-criticism to say, there's always room for improvement here, and we really wanna create, the path for people's success. I think that's so wonderful. But then you also have to be accountable to really say, okay, we created this code of conduct, 3 years later, are we really doing it? So you guys, for example, have all heard about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. For years, for over 20 years, we have heard the struggle of tomato farm workers in the fields of Florida. Have you gone back to see what's happening with those tomato workers? I can tell you, for example, from representing farm workers for years, most tomato workers to this day have no idea what the penny per pound is. So it makes you question, when businesses have been able to develop these amazing campaigns for the promotion of human rights, how much are they really, following up to make sure that the campaign is real after a certain time? I think that's how you measure the success of your business and your alliance with human rights. And I really think that those are the business values that you really need to rescue, to say, you know what, 10 years later, farm workers are still earning minimum wages or less than minimum wages. So I think it's very important to value those things. I mean, and I have shared a couple of the pitfalls, but I mean, the typical things that I see with businesses where, you know, it's like a can of worms. Most of the time that I go to a business because someone has asked for my representation, it's like the silliest things. It goes back again, human dignity. The typical one, for example, is a workers' comp issue. A worker injures himself in the job, goes to the employer, says, this happened to me. And what happens with the employer? That first responder's response, it's critical to your business, because as a lawyer, obviously, when I take a case, I start going layer after layer. Okay, so you're coming here because you injure yourself. What did the employer do? Well, the employer just said, here are some painkillers, we'll take you to the drugstore, and that's it. Then I start inquiring, how are you getting paid? How is your housing? This and that. And then I end up finding these huge cases, and obviously that's where I seek my class actions. But it shouldn't be that way. I mean, I think it should be, businesses really need to be proactive in that. And again, it goes back to knowing your workforce. The importance of treating someone, giving that person the 5-minute time to explain what they're going through, it's so important. Just like a grievance for sexual harassment. And I think for human resources, that's a big issue. Like human resources, we're so pragmatic in many ways, and everything is so practical, and we're always thinking in legal terms. Oh, how do we get, we don't want to be sued for this, but let's do this. But are we really taking the time to take that grievance seriously, to really go and start, peeling the onion layers and really finding out what are the real complaints of the employees? So when your blue wage worker comes and says, I feel like I'm being harassed by my supervisor. And obviously in these multinational companies, it is so hard. I mean, obviously leadership will never hear about those things. But for example, you are the human resource person in your business. What are you doing to take that grievance to the next level? Let's give the person the benefit of the doubt. You got the grievance, go and investigate. But go back to the entire workforce and find out if there is any other issues. This is the perfect time to address any other issues. Because, I mean, we all know a happy employee makes you successful. If employees are happy and they're feeling respected, your business will succeed. That's the key of it. And when employees don't feel that they're being respected for the silliest thing, the things that you think are the silliest, for them, that might be really important. When I'm asking my employer to please don't make me work on Sunday because, God, we have been working 6 days straight for 16 hours a day, please give me a break. And the employer might not be forcing that employee to work so many hours. And I think this is a big discussion, for example, in the packing house or apparel industry, where businesses, they just run continuously. If you are the employee and you want to have 18-hour days, go for it. But there has to be a time where the business actually stands up and says, you know what? I don't think this is good for you. I appreciate the fact that you as an employee wants to work so many hours a week, but for your own health, you shouldn't. At this point, we should limit the amount of hours that workers should be able to work, because this is the workforce that I'm actually protecting too. And I mean, obviously, we're not all California. I wish we had the wonderful state laws that you guys have here. I come from Florida, where it's a right-to-work state. It doesn't matter. Workers are really at the bottom of the ladder. And it's so important when a business actually starts creating that footprint to say, I'm gonna protect my workforce, I'm gonna make sure that they're getting the proper training, that they're getting the right tools, that they're actually having time to be with their families. If it's a guest worker, you know what, I'm gonna take the extra step to make sure that they can call their family, that I provide them with free internet so they can communicate with their family members. I'm gonna make sure that I drive them to Walmart so they can send money back to Mexico because they depend on this. I'm gonna make sure that I'm gonna pay my employees on time every Friday at this time so they have the opportunity to do all of these things that they need for their families. When an employer takes those proactive steps, the employee will certainly appreciate it, and they're not thinking on legal terms. They're thinking, this is a wonderful employer, and it's part of the commitment that I want to that I'm gonna do for my business? And let me see. So I always leave this question. I don't think we need to always think of human rights and businesses as an issue of right holders versus the business enterprise. I think that we always have to find that medium ground where we say, we are gonna establish those appropriate methods where, we are gonna include, we're gonna follow up on our human rights obligations. We're gonna make sure that we are improving the livelihoods of our employees, but we're also gonna think about the communities that we represent. The main thing that I always hear on trial, and it always kills me, I think it's the craziest thing, is this whole discussion about no good deed goes unpunished. And I hear that a lot with businesses. We have taken all these steps to make sure that laws are not broken, but here it is. We have a lawsuit against us for the same reason. And I'm thinking, it's all the craziest scenarios. And I was thinking, for example, about this from my own experience as a South American coming from Colombia, where we had so many, in the 80s and 90s, we had, we have a lot of American multinationals in the banana industry, for example. And because of the violence in the country, these multinationals were having a really difficult time protecting their employees, guaranteeing their safety. So the choice was, let's pay paramilitaries. And what that caused to the community around was terrible. So not surprisingly, you have heard of lawsuits in the United States where multinationals are being sued for practices overseas, which will make no sense. But it tells you, when a business says, okay, I am justifying my actions for the protection of my employees in this case, what am I doing to that community? And in my country, that was very clear, that by paying those paramilitaries at the expense of keeping your employees safe, those multinationals destroyed communities, destroyed families, destroyed a nation, because that money became something else, became the drug cartels, became all these movements that, and it destroyed a country. So, not surprisingly, they got sued. We see that with the Gulf of Mexico. Remember a few years ago with the oil spill, this was a big issue that, yeah, the oil is still there, and I'm sure you can share that perspective. What was the footprint to the communities around? Were we hiring local workers to help us with the oil spill? Many companies didn't. They started hiring guest workers. Then you had all these Indian workers in the middle of New Orleans who were living in horrible conditions, working crazy hours, but no one was listening to what was happening to them, to their plight. So, I'm always thinking of that. For example, carnival workers. You always think of Carnival first, the Midway. And tell me how much I'm time. I don't know, might be going crazy. Yeah. So, like Carnival workers, for example. I represent a lot of Carnival guest workers from Mexico. They come here, they entertain us, they go to the state fairs, they work crazy hours. But then when you go and check the housing that is being provided by the employer, they probably live in worse conditions than where they come from in their countries. And nobody's looking around, because when we think of human rights, we're always thinking outside, developing nations. But what are we doing here locally to make sure that the laws are not being broken? So those are the things that in general I try to encourage businesses, create the footprint, walk the talk, and really make sure that you take the first steps. And it's exactly like you don't have to do partnerships necessarily with NGOs. If you can take the reins and create those policies on yourself and, push those initiatives, I think that's the best thing that you can do for businesses and for a successful company in general. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you very much, Victoria. So kind of also opened up to our next speaker here, which is Kelly Melia-Tevan, policy advisor, global issues and public policy advisor for Chevron. Quite an extensive background prior to joining Chevron, has also held positions with the Rockefeller Foundation, working on the Foundation's Impact Investing Initiative, as well as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, supporting agribusiness and microfinance programs. Also worked with the company in East Africa Operations Manager for KRM Infrastructure. And so she's going to be talking to us a little bit about some perspectives now and in her current position with Chevron. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly.
All right. And I may not be physically disabled, but I am getting over a cold, so hopefully I'm still going to be understandable. Probably half the room is getting over a cold right now. But I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate and to represent not just Chevron, but I think a different perspective from a private sector standpoint in terms of coming from the extractives industry, so oil and gas as well as mining, although my company is specifically focused on energy, gas, natural oil and natural gas extraction, integrated in that we have an upstream presence, a downstream presence, and midstream, which is kind of a code word for getting things from the upstream to the downstream. So we, for example, have a shipping company. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into how complex our operations are, and therefore how complex this question of how to integrate our commitment to respecting human rights into our business is for us. It's not an easy job, and we have almost 50,000 employees around the world. That excludes our contract workforce, which is actually typically a multiple of that, depending on what stage of operations we are in a country. And we're in dozens of countries, and we have to be, so we don't really have much of a choice as well in terms of what countries we're in. If there's oil there and we have an opportunity to develop an asset in a country, that's where we're going, regardless of what the laws and the protections are in that country. So the UNGP framework is especially important and valuable to us, I think, because of that pillar one around the state duty to protect. We like that. We want to see more of that sort of activity out of governments because we are so sort of place dependent and are more or less captive to the geographies in which there are fossil fuel resources that we develop. So before I go any further, I just want to take a read of the room. Thank you, all you hardy souls who showed up on this really blustery day. But maybe with a show of thumbs up, middle, down, what are your impressions of the extractive industry, oil and gas specifically, and our record on human rights? Don't be bashful. I'll start with a labor rights lawyer, yeah. But yeah, please, yeah, down. Yeah, medium, down. You guys don't have to be nice just because I'm here. Yeah, fair enough. Our industry does not have the best reputation in this space. Part of that is because we're not a NUMI. We don't differentiate ourselves based on how committed we are to the UNGPs and human rights and responsible operations. You're probably not thinking about those things when you go to a gas station to fill your tank, right? You're thinking about price. We're a commodity, and we're kind of easily exchangeable with any other producer and offerer of that commodity. So for us, it's a little bit of a different dynamic that we're dealing with in figuring out not just how to operationalize and really codify our commitment to respecting human rights, but how to continue to improve on that commitment, especially in a context of an ever-changing world and ever-changing operating environments. So I'm happy to be here as an extractives representative to highlight some of the other concerns and issues that come up in our industry, because we've heard a lot about supply chain so far, which is absolutely an issue for us as well. But those thumbs down probably don't actually come from your knowledge of what we are or are not doing along our supply chain. They come from other issues that definitely have gotten a lot of media play over the last few decades. So just to go over a few of them, security. We heard a little bit about this in the Colombia context, but again, we operate in some really tenuous areas, and quite often that involves having to, in order to keep our workforce safe, having security provide protections from you name it. And those security forces, especially a couple decades ago, not necessarily extremely well trained on the use of force, and there's a lot of unnecessary violence in some of these contexts where you do have security forces trying to keep operations for a private company safe and protected. And also their impact on community members, right? We hear a lot of horror stories out of the mining and oil and gas sectors about what are these guys doing on their off hours in the communities that we work in. But I'll go into a little bit more about how because this is a longer standing issue for us. So fortunately, it's also one where a lot of really good work has been done. And I think you're seeing a lot less of this covered in the press thanks to that. And there's less impact to the rights holders, more importantly. Employees, so this is your typical book of issues, the ILO core principles, how they are applied in our operations. But in, freedom of association, collective bargaining, discrimination, working and living conditions, which for us doesn't just mean, safe factory floors. We operate in an extremely risky business, and we have a goal of sending everyone home at the end of the day, alive and well. That's not easy, and historically there's been a lot of challenges around that. It's one of the metrics that most of us in the industry report on an annual basis, fatalities. That's not a fun metric to have to report on. And in terms of UNGP context, if you're looking at the severity of your human rights impact, depriving someone of their right to life is way up there in terms of the level of severity. So we have to provide very safe, healthy working conditions for our workforce. That is our responsibility in terms of human rights obligations to our workforce, direct and contract. Community, these are ones that I think are a little bit better known in terms of what our industry looks like when we're not getting things right. What sort of impact are we having on Indigenous people? Absolutely a vulnerable group that has special protections in many jurisdictions, and there's steps that we have to take, sometimes above and beyond what we normally take in a community impact context when we have an Indigenous peoples population. Resettlement, again, the asset is where the asset is, or the oil is where the oil is. So what do we do if there's a community there? And trying to find a solution that involves good consultation with those community members, does not deprive them of their rights to livelihood, to health, to whatever cultural rights that they have. Grievances, are we hearing people if they feel that their rights have been abused or deprived in some way? How do we set up a means to get that information out of them and offer some sort of resolution remedy, talking about the third pillar? Livelihoods. This is important too, because there's a lot of things that we do. We create jobs, but we can also have a negative impact on livelihoods. Things like emissions to water, spills. If that's a fishery that you're spilling into and that community is dependent on that fishery to have an income and to feed their families and to sell fish at market, then you're impacting their right to livelihoods. So that's something we need to be aware of. And that's very much connected to environmental concerns. If air emissions are impacting the health of a community, we're impacting their right to health. And then finally, supply chain. Again, this is definitely an issue for us. It looks a little bit different for oil and gas companies than it does for sort of agricultural companies, apparel retail companies. All of these issues, again, the ILO menu is reflected here, but something that really defines our industry, particularly on the upstream side, is major construction projects. Some of our major tier one suppliers are some of the same engineering, procurement, construction companies that you saw in the headlines because of FIFA World Cup construction in Qatar, and a lot of the work camps and labor violations that were happening there. We need better performance out of those sort of suppliers. We need to not have forced labor on our construction sites. We need to have safe working conditions. We need passports not to be held. We need recruitment fees not to be charged. Conflict minerals, we have a very diverse operation supply chain. Conflict minerals are definitely something we deal with as well. So, again, UNGP framework, this is part of the work we have to do, assessing what our potential impacts are and prioritizing them. So this is kind of what you see. It's a long list. Maybe we're not that great at prioritizing, but we also have to keep in mind that severity lens. So now that we know what our issues are, how do we address them? which is the second step, right? So here's, UNGPs as a framework. This is another framework that we kind of use at Chevron to help us understand what we need to do to make sure that we are managing and mitigating any potential human rights impacts that we're having. And I break it down into sort of a 3-step. It's kind of sequential, but it also is very cyclical process frame, setting really clear expectations within your workforce. This all comes down to the employees, those 50,000 almost Chevron employees who have an individual responsibility to help the company as a whole, as a collective, meet our commitment to respecting human rights. So how do they do that? They have to know what we want them to do. If some part of their job potentially impacts any of those categories of potential human rights violations or impacts, they need to know that, and they need to know what good looks like in terms of making sure that we're respecting those rights. And you can do that in a number of ways. A policy, obviously, is major and necessary, especially according to UNGPs. But getting messaging from your executives in large companies, the executives have like a cult following in some instances. So having them tell the entire worker base, this is our human rights policy, this is your responsibility to help bring it alive, and take steps every day to make it so. And I think accountability is a huge part of this too, making it clear that expectations of your leadership, including your board, are that we're gonna follow through on commitments around human rights. Systematized processes, I'm gonna get into each of these in a little bit more detail. We're a little bit fortunate as an oil and gas company, an extractives company, as are our peers. Our long history with issues around human rights, and first and foremost, given what I'm going to talk about, the potential impact on right to life and freedom of injury, is that we have established really strong operational management systems. Again, we're diverse, we're all over the world. How do you hold every single one of your business units or employees to a consistent level of performance, whether it be around sort of your core operations and your, how you're maintaining profitability, but how do you make sure that you're adhering to a certain standard of health and safety practices? How do you make sure you're adhering to a certain standard of environmental stewardship? That's where our operational management systems come in. And it's a little bit boring, it's very process-oriented, but I work with a bunch of engineers. They love process. And so if you can't translate their obligations into process, you're not going to be as successful as you might otherwise be. And I love the engineers I work with. So again, I'll get into this in a little bit more, but this is really about managing risk, and human rights risk is part of that universe of risk that you can manage through a management system. And then assurance. So you have to know what you need to do, you have to have the tools and processes to do it, and then you have to check yourself. How do you know you're doing it? And this is also built into our management system. It's sort of like the end, not the end, because once you've checked, you go back and reestablish your expectations, recheck your processes, but have some way to measure your success, your performance on what you're being expected to do. So this is a little wonky, frameworky, but again, I work with engineers. This sort of stuff is important. So clear expectations. For Chevron, what this looks like, first and foremost, is our policy number 1, which is the Chevron Way, which provides a guidance to all of our employees about how we operate. And one of the first lines in that is that we operate in a socially and environmentally responsible manner, and we respect the law and universal human rights everywhere we operate. So this is communicated very clearly. This is, constitutional for our company. People carry copies, the hard copy of our Chevron Way little booklet in their shirt pockets. They are obsessed with this thing. And human rights is called out very clearly in one of the first sentences. So that's important in terms of making it clear what we stand for. We have our business conduct and ethics code. Our human rights policy is referenced in that and underlined that we have this commitment. It's an expectation of our employees. Everyone has to go through training every year, sign that they've read this and they understand it. We also have a similar code of conduct and ethics expectations that suppliers are given, which says the same thing. We have a human rights policy. Our expectation is that you have the same respect for human rights that we articulate in that policy. And speaking of the policy, so our history around it, in 2006, we had a statement that evolved in 2010 to the publication of our human rights policy. I'll be frank, a lot of the motivation for creating that policy and putting it out publicly did come from outside pressure. Shareholders were interested in seeing this to understand how we're managing that sort of social risk and the risk to our business. And kind of taking us through today, like I said, we're looking always at ways to improve. What are the changing expectations? What are the changing conditions? What are the changing laws? Where does our policy meet those expectations and changes to law? And where do we need to do more work? And that applies not just to the policy, but how we operationalize it. And then what you have under there is just like a smattering of, according to those 4 categories of more severe impacts, what are some of the processes, things, policies that we have in place that help us get there? And I'm going to go into detail on a little bit on a few of these so that you can understand, again, how do we make this real and do it every day? So getting back to our operational management system. For Chevron, we call it our Operational Excellence Management System, so OEMS. It's actually about to be revamped, so what you're seeing is about to be vintage, but it incorporates not just sort of the expectations around leadership and how we're going to operate, and the fact that there's an expectation that you're going to be tested to make sure you're doing what you're told, but a lot of clarity around 13 processes. It's a lot. That's part of why it's being revamped. But you'll see the bolded ones on this list. These are where we have embedded and touched human rights issues. Some of the most maybe impactful, I won't say important, are things like safe operations, security of personnel and assets. That's where we get to that sort of security force impact. Third-party services, that's where we talk about our supply chain, how we're managing that and risks there. Environmental stewardship, because environmental impacts become human right impacts in an instant. But stakeholder engagement, we have a dedicated process to stakeholder engagement, which means every single reporting unit around the world is required to do what that process says. Issue management process, same thing. And issue management includes stakeholder issues. So if stakeholders if they raise an issue to one of our reporting centers or business units, and it happens to be a human rights issue, we have a process that business unit has to follow for managing it. So getting into just a little bit more detail, this actually falls under our environmental stewardship process on the slide that I just showed you. But we have something called an environment, social, and health impact assessment procedure process. And it's meant to catch, yes, environmental impacts, but also potential impacts to, from a social perspective, livelihoods, human rights, and public health being very much tied to the human rights sphere. So this is a process that's required of any new project. If you're going to break ground on something, if it's a brownfield, you're building out an existing project, your business unit has to go through this. And it's a 5-step procedure. And the first 2 steps really encompass understanding what are your potential impacts. And it's literally a checklist, and there's literally the words human rights on there, and they're asked to consider these potential impacts before there's a lot. They have to go through those 5 steps before they can really get to operationalizing a construction project or whatever the nature of the project is. So this is how we do at a field level, on a very specific level, our impact analysis around human rights. And it's integrated with our environmental impact analysis because we really believe it's important to do this together, and stakeholder engagement runs throughout the process. So we are talking to community members, we're talking to government, we're talking to civil society, we're talking to other stakeholders. And finally, the assurance reviews. So how do you understand what you're supposed to do, you're being given the processes and the tools to do it. How do you know that you're doing it? And currently, our operational management system has an internal audit function. So that's kind of what I mean by assurance reviews. We can test how well you're doing. Do you have the things in place that you're supposed to have in place? Our stakeholder engagement processes, you have to have a stakeholder engagement plan. If we want to confirm that, we can. We will ask to see your stakeholder engagement plan. And a better example of this is actually, again, returning to the security issue. Our security personnel have to be trained on something called the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. That is a training that applies not just to our contract workforce, our direct workforce, and if that contract workforce is private, applies. If it is public, it applies. In some places, we're required to use public security forces because that's just what the government tells us. But we want them to be trained on appropriate use of force, all of the principles that are encoded in the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. And then what we do through our security management reviews is to say, okay, did you do the training? Did these folks get tested? Do we know that they understand what it is they are supposed to do and not do? So, yeah, and those happen, I think, every 3 years on a rotating basis all over the world. So I think that's all I had in terms of prepared slides, but my goal here was to really make real for you what it looks like to embed a commitment to respecting human rights into operations, and in the context of, obviously, an extractive. But this is how you really start to make sure that if you have tens of thousands of employees in dozens and dozens of countries, how do you do your best to follow through on that commitment regardless of which employee it is, or regardless of which country it is, or which asset, if it's upstream or downstream. It's a work in progress. Any company that tells you they've got this figured out is lying to you, or just doesn't know any better. And it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that on a multi-stakeholder level, because we want more companies on board. I think, you've got some leaders represented here. There's so many other companies out there. There's so many other companies that are not consumer facing, that are not in OECD countries, that know nothing about the UNGPs, and we need them brought into the fold. So it takes time. There's a lot of good work being done, but we need to start making the tent a little bigger and bringing more companies to the table and helping them understand the value of a commitment to the UNGPs. So that's my bit.
All right, thank you very much, Kelly. Very interesting perspective from Chevron, comprehensive internal plan that they have addressing some of the human rights and alignment with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And kind of now our last speaker is going to be essentially closing the loop, kind of circling back in a way to some of the things that Desta brought up, particularly with Nike. Our next speaker is going to be Catherine Daniels, who actually worked for 3 years as a manager of stakeholder partnerships at Nike, and similar to a lot of the other people on our panel, has also worked in both the nonprofit and for-profit sectors, which I think you'll see is a common thread in this area. And so she's also worked as a senior private sector advisor at Oxfam America, worked as a senior project officer at Management Sciences for Health, which is a global nonprofit dealing with high-quality health programs in leadership, management, and governance. And so I'm going to hand it over to Catherine Daniels to tell us a little bit about her perspective.
Thank you, Kevin, and all the faculty and staff for all the welcome and putting on the conference. It's really been a wonderful event, and it seems like we maybe had some turnover between the first panel and the second panel, but it was amazing, and I am so privileged to be at a school where I can walk into a business and human rights conference and hear words like, I wrote them down, shared humanity, or radical hope, or love. I wanted to talk about fear, and I will, but I was afraid that wouldn't be good. And so lo and behold, we talked about that in the first panel. So if you didn't get a chance to follow that, maybe catch up at the networking event to talk about that, because it was really great. And I've been doing this a while, and you don't often go to conferences where that's the case, so I really appreciate that. So I graduated from business school about 17 years ago, and in my class at American University, we didn't have anything like sustainability or responsibility, anything. In fact, when I said I was interested in international development, everyone thought like real estate development, or and it was lonely. I had a couple classmates and a great professor, business ethics professor, who guided us. But now I look around and I see programs and majors and 20 students as opposed to 1 back then, and I just do the math. I'm not actually good at math, but if I multiply that out, I'm hopeful that in 20 more years that will be a factor of a lot of people taking this important work forward. So in terms of my career, just so you understand where I'm coming from, I think I've spent about 1/3 of my time as an outsider, by which I mean working in civil society organizations or NGOs, pointing the finger at companies. If you Google me, you'll find me quoted as saying Nike should do more when I was at Oxfam, or Walmart should do more. I think I spent 1/3 of my time inside of companies and 1/3 of my time trying to get them to work together. And maybe another 1/3 working on humanitarian work in some far-flung, conflict-prone places. So I'm not a math person. That was more than 100%. But so there you have it. So I was going to title this Lessons from an Insider Outsider, but again, I didn't know if that would be cool enough. So, but that's sort of how I feel. That's kind of how I am. So I'll just share some observations of kind of kicking around this space for a while. We now have conferences like this, Business and Human Rights, and that's a wonderful thing. So the UN Guiding Principles have been adding fuel to that fire, and that's a great thing. We do, as has been mentioned, there's greater alignment. I talk to a lot of companies that are just so overwhelmed by the number of standards and codes, and you go to factories and the managers are so overwhelmed by all of their buyers' codes, and 10 years ago it was way worse, and now you're having greater alignment. So that's actually a very, very helpful thing that's been achieved over the last decade or more. And we have discourse, and we have a lot of working groups, and we have a lot of law firms and academics, and I've been working a lot the last 1.5 years on human trafficking in Asia, and there's all kinds of databases and apps and technology that's being deployed in support of solving these problems. So there's tons of momentum out there, which is great. And when I talk to companies that are grappling with some of these issues, it's overwhelming, right? So it'll be interesting to see how the next decade or so maybe achieve some sort of harmonization of those many, many solutions that are out there. So we've also seen an evolution from companies that, I call it the gotcha game. And some of us that worked at Oxfam, we played in that game. We would find the data that we wanted to prove our case. We would find a brand company, and we would find the data, and we would gotcha them in the public, in the media. And you need people like that. And when I was at Nike, I actually needed those activists gotchaing Nike so that when I was inside Nike, I could go to my coworkers and say, see, this is why we need to do this. The gotcha game is good. It's important. It's not the only game that we should be pursuing. And so I'll talk in a bit about evolving beyond gotcha. Does that make sense when I say the gotcha game? And so what I'm very optimistic about and appreciative of are these courageous acts of companies outing themselves before gotcha can gotcha them, realizing that they have a responsibility from a heart place, a reputation place, getting out in front of bad publicity, courageous leadership, recognizing a very difficult issue. And we didn't see that a long time ago. We would see instances, but I'm super amazed that we have this sporting goods store that's just taken such an active, and others, right? Like many others are now coming out and saying, we need to get out in front of the government. We need to go further. Apple, ExxonMobil, and Tesla, when our current administration pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Accord, said, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep reducing emissions because it's important for business continuity and stability, and it's the right thing to do. So now you're seeing companies stepping further than legislation, which is incredible. But there's a lot more to do. We've heard a lot of folks talking about supply chains, and the companies I talk to typically grapple with the issue of lower tier contracting. So I'm not sure if everyone understands what that means. In a nutshell, where do you buy your stuff from? Where do those people buy their stuff from? Where do those people buy their stuff from? Most companies know about where they're buying their stuff from. Some know further, but when you're talking about garments and the raw materials that went into that, the snaps, the zippers that go into a pair of jeans, the cotton, where was not only it grown, but where was the gin, where it was ginned, where was it milled, who was the trader involved, this idea of midstream, and we had to buy a shipping company to move. I mean, these are incredibly complex issues, and if I could go back and tell my 15-year-ago self at Oxfam, how complex this is, I don't know if I would have been nicer to myself pointing the finger inside at the company, but I'm sure glad that I now have that knowledge, having worked inside a company, to appreciate how difficult it is. And so we still have issues in many, many supply chains. And like I said, I've been working on human trafficking for the last couple of years now, and in Asia specifically. And you have a lot of challenges there. And so what I want to share with that is I think we need to, and so sorry, this is just a graphic of the excellent AP reporting on human trafficking in the seafood sector. So if you are looking for something good to read, please read it, have a look through. It's also beautiful photojournalism, which I'm really into. So before I show you that, I think what we need to figure out is not just how we can know what's going on in supply chains, but how we can work together to help figure out how to solve problems. And that's what I'm hoping the next iteration of my career of business and human rights will be. I think the first iteration has been good to raise awareness, right? But given how complex these issues are, as an insider-outsider, I think it does a disservice to only stay on one side or the other of those aisles, because it's one thing to elevate a company's awareness and then not support them in coming up with solutions, by which I mean companies are extremely good at being companies. They are not inherently in the business of solving human rights challenges. When given awareness about human rights challenges, many do want to take action. Some of them hire people like me who had previously been pointing the finger at them. Most need help, and this has spawned a whole industry of consulting firms and others that are willing to step in to help. I would urge everyone to try to stay open-minded to helping companies through partnership, through collaboration, through just working on solving some of these problems. They're great at business. They're not necessarily innate. It's not their natural, their MO is not human rights. And so we have an onus and a responsibility to help companies that are willing to take sincere efforts forward. So this is a hard thing. It sounds really easy, but it actually gets to some of these issues that we talked about in the first panel, starting to get to these, like we talked a lot about a lot of stuff from the head, right? Like a lot of codes of conduct and UN guiding principles and responsibilities, and these are all very heady subjects. And I think we need to start to get comfortable in our discourse of matters of the heart, which is why I love the first half of this conference and the space that St. Mary's is finding itself in, because this starts to get into some really heart issues, some emotional issues, risk-taking being one of them. So when I worked at Nike, I found it fascinating that a company whose motto was just do it was so reticent to just do stuff when it involved partnerships or trying new things. And that isn't because they weren't good people. And you learn that when you actually go to work inside companies, that people are people, and they care about their children and their happiness, and they're not evil people with horns that wake up in the morning trying to hurt other people. They just sometimes need some help. I lost my train of thought. What was I saying just before that? So they're scared. They are afraid to take risks because when your brand is absolutely everything and your employer is going through a massive downsize, restructure, reduction in force, and maybe you're the breadwinner for that, for your family through working for that company, you might be a little hesitant to step up and try something risky, to try something new. And so those of us on the outside maybe try to help support and give bravery to those people within companies that maybe need a bit of courage and support. And fear. Fear is something that we talked about in the first panel, and it comes through companies, it comes through NGOs, it comes through all of us as humans. To figure out why are we doing what we do and why are we not doing what we're not doing. So I'm not going to talk at all about these partnerships, but they're great, and I'll be happy to share more info during the networking, or you could look them up. But I want to talk about the magic in the middle, which is this middle space where you've got activists who are, their basic reason for existence is to investigate and pressure companies. Companies, their basic MO is to manage and respond to risk. And everyone's very good at doing this, but when you stand on either sides of the aisle continuing to investigate and pressure and continuing to respond, I spent an entire year doing issues management at Nike to figure out how to respond effectively. When you can actually meet in the middle and reach out across, you can find the solutions because they're there. It takes incredible courage to say, I don't know, actually. I don't know the answer. Because when you're a company whose shareholders expect you to know everything and be expert at what you're doing, it's not okay to say, I don't know. That takes bravery. That takes courage. So in the middle, to be aware of what you don't know. Maybe on the NGO side, you don't actually know what it's like to work inside a company. Can you ask yourself, what might that person be going through? What might that company be going through? Can a company maybe ask itself what's motivating others around? To then act, and then taking risks is absolutely key, because anyone can put together a code of conduct, anyone can hire a consulting firm to go out and do independent audits of their factories. But is someone willing to say, we're no longer going to sell assault weapons, and we're actually not going to sell any weapons to anyone under 21 years old? That's a risk. And so that's the magic in the middle, where I think the compromise, if there's a compromise to be had, lives, and where future progress is going to reside. So what I mean by that is, I've been thinking a lot about the gun debate. So I live in Vermont, and it's a very, very pro-gun state. We have a lot of hunters, and it's also very liberal in pockets. And so I went to the Vermont legislature to listen to this gun control hearing, and I was amazed at how ping-pong the arguments back and forth went between hunters who don't want to have their rights infringed upon and folks who are concerned about gun safety. And they were just ping-ponging back and forth, and there was no, like you could have gone on all night, and there was no recognition or positioning in the middle, which kind of left me really bummed out. I walked out of the hearing thinking, how is this ever, where's the compromise? It made me think of the Game of Thrones episode, I don't know which season it was, where Tyrion Lannister, while Daenerys Targaryen is away, makes a deal with the slavers in Slavers Bay. Is anyone following me on this? Somebody? And so what happened, it was like really not a good deal, right? It was kind of awful. It was like, you can continue to engage in slavery for like 5 years, but after 5 years, you've got to stop. And everyone was like, how can you do that? That's horrible. And he said, you know, this is the necessary evil it's going to take to get to where we want to be in the future. I'm not suggesting that's okay. Slavery is awful. Please don't misinterpret me. What I'm saying is, when I walked out of the gun control hearing, I thought, where is the space to figure out that equivalent? Can people who want to have their liberty and their guns find something that they can give? And can activists who want to have safety find something that they can give back? And that's where I think for business and human rights, where you've got activists that want, and you've got companies that are so afraid of those activists who are really loud. I used to be one. Where can there be that middle? That's where it's going to take real bravery to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. And those are heart conversations. They're not head conversations. I live in Vermont. I was walking my dog last week and I took a picture, and I thought it was interesting because the other thing, so this is a pallet that somebody just put out because it's really muddy, and you don't want to walk in the mud. And so someone put out a pallet to help you get on over it, and then it got smashed in the winter because it's really snowy in Vermont. And it was just lying like that. It was smashed, and it said one way, and I thought, that's such a metaphor for something. I don't know what. I'm going to take a picture of it and maybe present it at this conference, but I don't really. And I was looking at it, and I thought, someone has smashed the whole idea that there's one way. And that's absolutely true for business and human rights. We are making this stuff up, and anyone who tells you any differently is lying, to your point, Kelly. So as you're learning this in undergrad and grad school and in your careers, there's no right way, which is kind of scary and kind of a bummer and kind of awesome, because it means you have the ability to help try things, to take risks and try things, because there's no right way to do any of this stuff, and you're not going to screw it up because it's already pretty screwed up. So I'm glad I could retrofit something to use that photo for. And then the other thing I would say, if you're in business school or if you're working in the world, for all of us really, I'm really into this head and heart, and I think we can study all we want, all of the UN guiding principles, they're important. We can study all the frameworks. We can study all of the doctrines from Catholic social teaching that we heard about this morning. We can study. And at a certain point, we also kind of have to study ourselves and study humans if we're going to be able to successfully engage in humans. That's all this is a human-to-human dynamic, human rights. So there's some skills that I sure wish someone had told me about when I was in business school, because I was so focused on financial accounting and got a C in it. But so I was jotting some of these down this morning, but then I heard some way better ones as I was listening to the speakers. So Ted, who was here earlier, talked about shared humanity. Just think about that for a second. Actually, Brian Buckley mentioned, how do we engage with people from other places, refugees, and the idea of seeing each other, and seeing each other not as other, but as part of that shared humanity. That is incredible if you can try to figure out a way to do that in your everyday life, but also within business and human rights, because when I go out on trips to developing countries with clients, I remember when I was in the Peace Corps in Guinea, in the middle of nowhere, I was in a village, this is 1996, I was in a village, no electricity, no running water, no transportation, really. Most of the vehicles were these rusty Jeeps, Russian form, terrible, and we would often break down in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, we broke down, and I was the only Westerner within hundreds of miles. I mean, didn't live with anybody in my village. There we are in the middle of nowhere, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning. This Jeep is just broken down, and I don't have a place to sleep. And this guy, about this big, probably 70 years old, comes out of his hut and leads me to a bed made of hay and was like, sleep in this hut. And it's interesting to be the one who is not in privilege. Try to have a few experiences in your career where you're not in privilege. It's really a good lesson in shared humanity. When someone who has nothing gives you the little nothing they have, it will show you about shared humanity. And when we can see each other and look into each other's eyes through the humanness and the interconnectedness, I think that's going to help transform business and human rights way into the future beyond UN Guiding Principles 2.0, which is important. And when we're writing those, are we really imagining the other people as people, that we could be those people? And lots of people said some other awesome things, but I'm kind of running long here. But the fear and perfection and collaborations, and Dusty, you talked about thoughtfulness of humanity, which has been on my mind a lot about mindfulness. And both Victoria and Kelly talked about real, like real commitments, things that actually have to be real for employers to make real commitments rather than having, the penny a pound campaign really not have achieved very much. Are we looking at real commitments and action? So I think that's all I've got. Oh, I have one more photo from Vermont as I was walking my dog. I think fear has been a big thing that I've been working with personally, and as I've been opening up to it, it's helped me with that human connection. And as I work with clients, I try to, and I'm not really great at this, but I'm trying to find ways to get at, like, what are you afraid of? And in the early days, I'd be like, well, what are you afraid of? And they'd be like, well, I'm not afraid of anything. And now I'm trying to get more sophisticated to figure out, like, how you draw that out tenderly. But it's always there. There's always something. And as humans and our shared humanity, if we can learn to just acknowledge it and then let it go, and within each of us, there's this, like, strongness, right? So in Buddhism, we talk about strong back, soft front, and Brené Brown is talking about that a lot as well. So what is our fear, and how can we kind of acknowledge that, but then within us find our strength? And so what was super cool about this was, I don't know if you can see it, but everything's gray, Vermont's gray this time of year, but there was this amazing ice that came down this river, and it was just stuck there on a dam, and there's this amazing blue color that doesn't look nearly as cool in the photo, but I promise you it was amazing, and I thought, it's like kryptonite. And it's in the middle of this giant, ugly thing that's frozen and rocky and hard and awful. And then I went to see Black Panther, and I was like, no, it's like vibranium. It's this amazing metal that's beautiful and wonderful. And we have that within us. We have that beauty and that wonderful quality within us that's shrouded beneath our rocky, hard, fearful self. And this river was melting this day, and so this ice was melting around it, and that blue was getting bluer and bluer, and I just thought, I don't know what that means, but I'm going to show it at the conference, and maybe they can help me make meaning out of it. But again, to figure out what's within us, to try to figure out how we might be holding ourselves back from connecting with others as we try to solve these huge issues, but recognizing that we have a lot of this stuff within us that's strong, and we should not forget that. So I'm pretty sure that's my last slide. Unless it shows me the video, I was able to. Here's Vermont, everybody. And that's all I got. So please come visit Vermont. It's wonderful. And a bunch of brands that are doing really great things. And just my categorization of how I think of them in my mind, this is too much to go into now. Somebody mentioned it earlier, ethos. I can't remember, somebody mentioned ethos. There are companies that do this, business and human rights, because they can't not do it, right? The B Corps, the Patagonias, like Yvonne Chouinard can't not try to solve environmental problems, right? And you got a lot of folks who are seeing the gotcha game and fearful and trying to get out in front of it. And then you got a lot of companies in the shadows, and that's bigger for a reason. And Kelly mentioned there's a lot of others that need to be brought into the tent. You've probably never heard of these companies because I hadn't. Major palm oil supplier to the major retailers, major suppliers to apparel and footwear companies. Brands you don't recognize, and that's the tent that needs to get bigger, is the lower tier suppliers, and maybe we can try to take some of that, self-awareness and knowledge and guiding principles and codes of conduct and all that stuff that we've learned and start to really hold others to the fire to try to make sure that they're bringing their commitments along as well, so that maybe in 10 years, we're having bigger conferences with more companies in developing countries that are so critical to making this happen. So that's really it, I promise, the end. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you to all my panelists. I don't know if we're pretty much out of time here, so if you have any specific questions for them, you can ask during the break time that we have now. So thank you very much. And we'll be meeting back at 5:30.